You're listening to the Vint Wine Podcast, where you'll hear interviews and stories from around the wine world. From writers and critics to winemakers and sommeliers, we'll explore the people and businesses who are instrumental in shaping wine culture. Enjoy the show. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Vint Wine Podcast, a production of the Vint Marketplace, your source for the top wines and spirits in the world at vintmarketplace.com. As always, I'm joined by Billy Galanko. How you doing, Billy?
Doing very well. Back from my travels and ready to kick off a new season of podcast recording.
Yeah, you've been a jet setter. We said that you were going to come back with stories from some of the top chateaux. Did you get to go anywhere special?
Yeah, we went to a ton of places. When we were in Bordeaux, didn't quite make it to any first growth, but made it to a bunch of really exciting producers across the board. In Burgundy, one of the highlights was Domaine Dujac, which was fun to go in some of their old vineyards, the Clos de la Roche, like Vieilles Vignes section of their vineyard, and a lot of different sections were really, really cool, and just basically made a pilgrimage to every famous vineyard in all of Burgundy, Montrachet, Romanée-Conti, Chambertin, all of that. And then towards the end of my time in Burgundy, I did spend an hour and a half or so, a little bit more, with William Kelley and one of his vineyards. He now has a number of plots around Burgundy, and we're with him and Liam Darcy, who helps him with his viticulture and also owns a label and some wine that he makes in Piemonte, and also was with one of his other winemakers. And it was really cool. I was just there taking notes, asking questions, and just watching them, basically learning their pruning techniques and how they're trying to basically bring some of these vines that weren't tended as well 10, 15 years ago back to full production. And they've been working on them for 4 years now. And it was really cool to see the progress that the vines have made.
Yeah, that's your first Burgundy trip, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Isn't it crazy? You can just walk up to DRC, like La Tâche, Romanée-Conti, and just wander through. Not like through the rows, but basically right there at the vineyards.
Yeah. Yeah. No, you had mentioned it before, so thought I was prepared, but what also kind of stood out to me is unless it has like a wall, things have very little signage. So there are many famous vineyards you go by and you just can't tell where one starts and one ends, aside from there might be a little path. And a lot of these paths on Google Maps, that you probably know as well, are labeled as roads. So I was driving, trying to get like a closer view, going from Moët Saint-Denis over to like Chambertin, and I almost drove like directly into the Grand Cru vineyard, La Trussier Chambertin. Like I'm going, and I couldn't tell if the road was road or dirt, and I ended up having to back up half a kilometer just like directly backwards.
Yeah, I also thought that being there, and not that you can see below the soil and know what the composition everywhere is, but just the relative proximity of all the vineyards to one another. And it's like this La Tâche is basically right next to XYZ other vineyard, like feet away. And then just considering the differences in the prestige of some of those and pricing and all of that, it's like, how different could they really truly be?
Yeah.
But obviously there are notable differences on the aggregate, but standing there looking at it, it's a little bit hard to conceptualize.
Yeah, I think I was there at a really special time, and we got the opportunity to go all through the Côte de Nuits and Côte de Beaune, and then also up to Chablis. And was the three things that kind of stood out to me. One were the undulations, or the general topography that you don't really get a sense of from photos, especially in Chablis. We went to the Grand Cru Hill of Chablis, and I had no idea how different, how undulating, I guess, the whole hill was. I looked at it as a monolith, and you get close and there are these little like valleys and stuff. And the same through all the little places in Burgundy as well, the specific vineyards. The other two were, while I was there, it was a certain time of year, and it was really cool to see the different farming practices. Even in a single vineyard, you could tell who owned certain rows just by maybe one was completely tilled, or one was tilled with cover crops, one was pruned a certain way, one was not pruned yet. You could really see the individual farming decisions by each plot, and I thought that was really cool. And since they were plowing certain rows at this time, you could see some of the stones turned up. So it was cool because you could see the different compositions of the soil as they were turned up from one plot just over 10, 20, 30 feet to another plot. So that was really neat too.
Yeah, you talked about some of the like peaks and valleys and curvatures in the in the hillsides. And the last thing I'll say is just I was struck by how gradual the sloping of, well, for instance, I'm just in my mind, I'm picturing when we were in Romanée-Conti and just the gradual sloping of the hillside up the Grand Cru vineyards. It's just much more gradual than it looks like when you look at like topography maps and things, like when you're just looking at a 2D or 1D view.
Yeah, definitely. When they say mid slope, you don't necessarily feel you're on the middle of a big slope.
No,
it's just
right.
so long. So after Burgundy, tasted a bunch, got really well acquainted with the 2022 vintage for red and whites, because that's what we were served with. The Albert Bichot hosted us, and then they have a number of domains under them. So we tasted a bunch of their properties. I got to go to Domaine Dujac. They have a tasting cellar and a tasting room in. Also, they have a press that's, I can't remember how old, like nearly 1,000 years old, or it's at least 500 years old, in this winery that's in the middle of Beaune. And one reason I wanted to go is, one, they still use that press that's been around for hundreds and hundreds of years. They last used it, I think, sometime in 2000. You can buy a bottle of the wine that they made with that press, which is really cool. But there is a section of that cellar underneath that they walled off during World War II, and it's in that Wine and War book that we had the authors on a while back. And that was really cool, because I'd always wanted to see where the section of the cellar that they had walled off to make it look old, to hide the wine from the Nazis. So that was really cool.
Oh, that's sweet. Yeah. And then you say you got to spend time at Domaine Pinceau. Did you meet Laurent in person?
Well, this is the Domaine. So remember, he left, what was it,
his family. It's his family.
It's
Domaine.
the family one. It's the OG one.
Okay.
Which is funny. I definitely like Laurent's new wines too, but William Kelley asked me which one I went to. And then the other guy also helping prune is, oh, you went to Pinceau? And he went to the real one. He went to the real Pinceau. And I was like, oh, okay. I see how it is. Laurent's still cutting his teeth there in terms of establishing his brand amongst the Burgundy. But so after Burgundy, though, I drove down. I drove all the way down to Hermitage to go see the hill. I've always wanted to see it. It's just as impressive in person as I thought it would be. I tasted at Chaput, and I really wanted to go up the hill. I didn't get there till the very end of the day. A rainstorm had been rolling in, so and some roads getting up the hill were closed. Typically, you can just hike straight up, but it was getting too dark for me to hike up. So I drove all the way around, basically all through Clos Hermitage to this farmland, and got to the very kind of top of Hermitage, not quite to the chapel, and drove down this very narrow dirt road in a pouring rainstorm and a mistral that was blowing. I had to lean into the wind. I'll have to show you I guess the listeners can't see, but I have a video of me basically leaning into the wind, getting blasted by 40, 50 mile an hour winds and rain in Hermitage. And that was a really cool experience, because those are all the things that you hear about the wind coming down the Rhône Valley and the steep hills. So I'm basically just sitting there with these Syrah vines on sticks, just holding on for dear life.
And I'm sure I could see you going up those little hills in your rented Peugeot or Citroen or whatever you had rental car.
Yeah. Spot on. It was a Peugeot. Yeah.
Peugeot,
puttering along.
Yeah. Peugeot is like a half the size of a Prius here in the States.
I completely underestimated the clearance of this car. I definitely smashed it a bunch, because I'm driving on these dirt roads and vineyards, and luckily they did not notice any damage. I tried to clean it off before I returned it, but so yeah, train went from there, and then stayed in Lyon, drove back up from Hermitage to Lyon, and then spent the next week in Bordeaux with the MW group, and each day I was with the group both in Burgundy and Bordeaux. It's 8 a.m. You're on a bus. You don't get back until after a dinner that was hosted by someone until 11. So they're long days. We spent a lot of time in Bordeaux. It was hosted by the Clos Grand Cru Classe 1855. So we went to saw a turn producer. We had a nice tour and tasted at Giraud, and then spent the next couple of days exploring Saint-Julien, Pauillac, and tasting some wines from Saint-Estèphe as well. So it was, and Margaux. We went around Margaux as well. So we basically got a good sense of all the communes up there on the left bank.
So were you being driven around basically for all of those? I guess you couldn't branch off and slip over to Ecam or wherever else you wanted to go, any of the first growths, just to snoop around. It was kind of structured.
Yeah. No, we were on a bus, had a very tight schedule. So there's a bunch of chateaux that were gracious enough to host us. So we basically got behind the scenes at a number of them. Pichon Baron was one, Ducru Bacula. I'm blanking on some of the other ones now. Brent Cantonac, a few. But basically, yeah, we were set up. And then a lot of people, since I had been there for so long during the Burgundy trip, I came home. But a lot of people on their free day then went to the next tier. So a bunch of people went to Figeac. A few people I know went to Margaux, and then people went to Petrus and Yquem. So I was very jealous because I could have stayed on and gone to some of those, but I'd been gone for 10 days already and need to be done.
Yeah, so you were out a little bit early and you did the Burgundy stuff, right? And then went over to Bordeaux, right?
Yeah, these were two separate trips that you kind of had to apply and get accepted to. The Burgundy one was much tougher to get into, only 12 people, and that was all MW students could apply to that. Whereas the second Bordeaux trip was just for stage 1 students, and it was more like an intro.
Yeah. Now, was it all a lot of just like a lot of wine talk in the downtime, or what's the culture of these traveling MW groups?
Yeah, it's a lot of these. So there were very few Americans, so it's learning more about wine and different, or learning just more about where people are from. But the cool part about the Master Wine program is you have everybody from like merchants to winemakers to importers to just people working at the vineyard. So a lot of it in the downtime was just, what do you do in the wine industry? And then learning more about that, and then endless wine questions, because you only get to know everybody for 3 days or so before you have to split up. So it was pretty cool. Everybody was, and I think that was the most interesting part for me, is just learning what everybody else does. The world of wine is so big, and the people who decide to work in it as a career tend to be really interesting. So no matter who you talk to, you have something you love in common, and then you get to just go down these rabbit holes.
Yeah, well, our listeners know that, and listening to the podcast, that we're endlessly interesting people. So I guess it applies across the wine world. But the actually interesting people that we have on our guests on this podcast, and you mentioned a few of the folks that we've already had on. Like you got to spend some time with William Kelley.
Yeah. It's fun with him.
Cool.
Past guest.
Yep.
And now we have
their name, obviously, some relation. We've had Laurent on our podcast as well, and so we're hitting all corners.
I forgot to mention one of your favorite past guests, the winemaker from Gusbourne, was also on my Bordeaux trip. She's very
nice. Oh, cool.
Yeah,
very good. English sparkling. Shout out English sparkling wine.
Yeah, for sure. But speaking of, I guess we'll round this out. On my Bordeaux trip, I also got to meet this week's guest. It is Roderick Smith, who is the chairman of the Institute of Masters of Wine. I really wanted to have him on, I guess, to give everybody a sense of, we talk about what the Master of Wine program is. Obviously, we talk about me being in it, and we have Masters of Wine on as guests all the time, but we never really talk about what the institution is, what it does, or how it works, and then how it's different from, say, the Master Sommelier program. So I thought it would be really interesting to have him on, really explain what the institute is and what it does, and what the role is in the general wine world.
Yeah, Ron's was really easy to talk to. He's a great ambassador for the MW program and just for wine in general. But he started as an artist, right? He graduated from the Chelsea School of Art in the UK, and then ended up working in some wine shops, and then moved his way through. Actually, he was selling wine with a company that provided wine for like super yachts in the French Riviera, as he tells us on the episode, and along the way got his MW, and now is the chair of the whole thing. No one better to explain what it's like to move through the program and actually achieve the title of Master of Wine than him.
Yeah. And then before we move on to our interview, I did want to make a note upcoming. We're not going to do news this week just because I had so much to share of my own personal travels, and we don't want to keep you guys too long. But we are going to be having a number of really interesting, at least we think interesting, producers coming on soon. And with those, we are going to be releasing a new mini podcast that will come out the Friday before the producer episodes. And this one's going to basically be called something like 5 Questions with a Winemaker, and it's going to give you a snapshot of what these wineries are all about and these winemakers in 5 questions. So it'll be a short mini pod that'll come out ahead of our larger interviews with wine producers.
Yeah, something to look forward to on off podcast days, maybe Fridays. And so, yeah, they won't be super long, but just something extra for listeners to tune into, and really good to share around with friends who maybe you hear about a producer that their story sounds interesting, their wines sound interesting, easy snippets to share and learn more about more producers that you might not have heard of.
Yep. Easy way to learn about producers without having to spend an hour. And then if you are intrigued by them, you can dive into the full episode. So we think it'll be a great addition to the Vint Wine Podcast repertoire.
Nice. And so before we get into our interview with Rod, I just want to say again, check out our online wine and spirit store at vintmarketplace.com, where you can find all the cult classics from Bordeaux to Barolo, as well as niche producers, your favorite masters of wines and sommeliers are drinking, folks that we have on the podcast. We have one of the largest selections of inventory in the U.S. and some of the most competitive pricing. Whether you're an enthusiast or a collector, the Vint Marketplace is your go-to shop for stocking your wine cellar. And now, without further ado, here's our interview with Roderick Smith, Master of Wine.
All right, we are here with a very special guest, chairman of the Institute of Master of Wine, Rod Smith. Thanks so much for joining today.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you very much, Billy. Thank you, Brady.
Yeah, very exciting. I got to meet you in person just a few days ago, and it's great to have you on. We have so many things to talk about. I really want to hear a little bit more about your background because we didn't get to touch on that the other night, and then share a lot more about the Institute of Master of Wine.
Yeah, perfect. Be my pleasure.
Awesome. Do you want to start with a little bit about your background? Maybe, I know you've probably done this a million times, but maybe a little bit about what drove you into a life in wine, and then maybe what led you to the chairmanship of the IMW.
Well, that's a long journey, but yeah, of course. I grew up, my parents were not especially into wine. They didn't have a problem with wine, a bit of wine at Christmas and so on, but not much. And I was studying art. I studied art at Chelsea School of Art in London. And I just wanted a job at Christmas just to get some money. And I went into, it's called the job centre, like a labour exchange. And I don't know what you call them in America, but advertised jobs. And there was a job in what I thought in the UK is called an off licence, just somewhere that sells alcohol. And I thought, great, cheap beer. That's the perfect Christmas job, that is. I wasn't even 18, which technically I think made it naughty because you can't sell alcohol in the UK until you're 18, but I was moving boxes really. And it just happened that wine shop was run by someone who was absolutely wine mad. And his enthusiasm, I'll always be grateful to him, his enthusiasm for wine. He opened bottles just after they'd been delivered and tasted, we've got to taste this. And it was just about the time when Australian wine was becoming big in the UK. And it's just a really exciting time to start in wine. So although I had no interest in it before that, particularly, suddenly, even in a few weeks, I started getting interested in it. And then I did my degree, my second qualification up in Scotland. And I ended up working in the same chain of wine shops in their Scottish branches and then back in London on Saturdays and holidays and stuff. And I just met some really nice people, really good people. And then I graduated with a degree in illustration and printmaking and graphic design, which wasn't very useful in the early 90s. When I started, people did lettering with a pen, and when I finished, people did lettering with an Apple Mac. The last places to get the equipment, the academic places, are expensive. And I just couldn't really make it as an illustrator financially. And eventually I just thought, do you know what? Maybe I'll do wine for a living and pictures for a hobby. And that's what it became. I ended up working back in that same chain of shops. I ran a shop and then I went to the head office and did the marketing, met with the buyers, and then to its parent company, which was a wine importer. And from there, yeah. And the rest is history, really. And then in 2007, I moved from the UK to the south of France. And it was for a job selling wine to the big private yachts in Antibes and Monaco, which is not quite as much fun as it sounds, but it is certainly as interesting as it sounds. The mega rich are quite, I think it's fair to say, demanding people. They would always want whatever they wanted yesterday with 2 pallets of Evian water, and they moved. So it's easier now with GPS, but back then when I started, they would suddenly, our van driver would turn up in one port and the ship would say, well, we're in Saint-Tropez now, so they'd have to go off. But really, really interesting time, and I got to interact with some of the world's truly great kind of unicorn wines. And all the way along, I love studying, I love learning. In lockdown, I tried to learn a bit of Mandarin. I speak a couple of languages. But logically speaking, Master of Wine was a qualification that a lot of people in wine aspired to in the UK, perhaps more than in America, and it's changing now. MW is becoming more global, so is CMS, but it was a kind of British thing at first. And yeah, I did the WSET qualifications, and then eventually I was working with a guy who was a Master of Wine, and he just encouraged me in and said, I think you can do it, which is flattering. And yeah, I managed to pass. And that was good. And then I loved communicating the knowledge. So I ended up, once I'd passed MW, helping out on the tutorial side. We try not to call it education because it's a self-study program, as Billy. You've got to do it all by yourself. But we offer as much help as we can. And more now than we used to. And I take great pleasure in that. Especially because living in France, one of the disadvantages of France is that it's very difficult to get wine that isn't French, which I totally get. Wine countries sell their own wine. But I really enjoyed taking part in the MW study program because it gives me the chance to taste the same wines you've been tasting recently, which are hard to get in France. Yeah. That's a long answer to the question. Is that the right answer to the question? Or would you like me to carry on?
That's great. I mean, I want to double click on the time that you spent selling wine or I guess procuring wine for high-end clients, because I don't think we've had anyone on the podcast that works at that tier of concierge wine service and delivery. Any interesting stories from that time working on the...
Yeah, quite a few. I've actually signed a couple of NDAs. That's how high up it is. There was one yacht you had to hand in your phone before you went on. It was that kind of thing. I can't even say. There's a few. I've got loads and loads of really good stories, but can I anonymize a story? Yeah, there was one time we were asked for some. I think it was Romney Conti. I can't remember, but something very, very, very fine, and it was going outside the EU, so it was really hard to ship it. And eventually, we went back to them and said, "Look, we can get the wine, but the only way we can possibly get to you is to charter a plane," thinking that would be the end of it. But they then said, we'll do that then. It was then that we occurred to us that actually they probably knew a lot more about chartering airplanes than we did. And that's what happened. And I can easily imagine that guy, it was that night, saying to his friends, you want to know what I went to get this wine here? And of course, all he did was sign the bill. But the bill for the transport was far more than the bill for the wine. And it was very expensive wine. So sometimes that kind of thing would happen. But I think a lot of people think, oh, these mega rich people, they're buying brands, they're buying names, they don't know what they're drinking, they don't appreciate it, and all that kind of stuff. And I think if you supply anything to anyone, you're very arrogant if you look down your nose, if you look disparagingly at them. No one buys anything twice if they couldn't see the point the first time. So yeah, there are probably some people who buy famous names to show off. But at the same time, it's a drink. And if they don't drink it and enjoy it, they're not going to buy it a second time. Most very rich people are rich for a reason, and they're careful. So I think it's very arrogant to say, oh, these people, they don't understand. They're robbing us of the ability to have these wines. There will always be expensive wines. And I think as an industry, we need that, and we should rejoice in it. There's a lot of people in our industry who make money out of the fact that somebody at the end of it is prepared to spend an awful lot to put it down their throat. Without those people, we'd all suffer. So yeah, it means that the opportunities we have to taste Romney Conti and Petrus and Screaming Eagle are limited. But we know where to find the alternatives that are better value in a similar style. And we need those people, and we need those wines supplying them. I firmly believe that. And I've got some very nice stories of people who really appreciate what we do. Yeah.
That's a great point. I've heard that a lot, where and even producers will get clammed up about talking about the price of their wines on secondary markets and so forth. And I've always thought that that's really good for the market, like you said, to have a handful of producers who command astronomical prices. And somewhere along the line in our industry, someone who loves wine is capturing that value, right? And maybe it should be the producer more. Producers can certainly raise prices. But I appreciate you acknowledging the relative value of some of those high secondary markets.
I think it is important. I met with Loic Pasquet of Pata a few weeks ago. He's charisma on a stick. You can see exactly how it works. And basically he charges that because he knows that if he doesn't, someone else will. And it should be the person who grows it who makes them, especially when he takes as many risks as he does. I'm not talking innately about the quality of the wine, but the quality of him and his attitude. It can't really be criticised on that. Plus, as we know, anyone can spend a lot of money on a bottle of wine and get a good one. It's spending not a lot of money on a bottle of wine and getting a good one that's the secret. And if you can do that, then you win. Yeah, the more you get into wine, the more you know where to look. The second wine of the great producers is better than the top wine of the lesser producers, and the appellations or the regions that provide the undiscovered secrets. And for me, that's the joy of wine, is that there are still great wine regions that we don't know about yet, that haven't yet got vines. And I don't think that's exclusively in kind of crazy bits of Australia or climate change or whatever. I think that's even Sardinia and bits of Italy and bits of Spain and even Languedoc and stuff like that. There are plenty of places where there will be great wine in the future, but it's not acknowledged yet, and it's priced to match. And it's really exciting to discover those. And that doesn't cost a lot. But meanwhile, our industry is slightly propped up by people who spend a lot on the very best of things. And I think that's fundamentally a good thing, because it makes everyone realize that wine is it's not just a product to drink. It can be a sort of artisanal work of craft and great. And it's a very unique agricultural product in that respect, because you've got some serious expensive stuff like truffle and saffron, but you haven't got a product that goes from absurdly cheap to crazily expensive in the way that wine does. I know you can spend a lot of money on some weird donkey milk cheese, but the gap is still not as wide as it is with wine, and that's to be embraced, I think.
Yeah. No, I think I was actually just listening to someone else go on about how they're actually they're buying wine for really young wine, really wealthy folks, people who are massive collectors, but they're under the age of 40. And part of what they want to do is learn the classics, but they also want to know what's next, or what's that next big thing, like you were mentioning. So I think that's the value you can add. And part of what experience, because people always ask me now, it's, well, I can just go online and buy that. Like, what is the value of like wine experts in the future in terms of accessing something if it's so readily available online, as opposed to like back in the day, that was part of the key value, was just sourcing it or finding the price in the first place. And now it's transitioning a little bit. Do you think that's the case?
Yeah, I do. And in some way, I'm sure we're going to come on to it, the whole AI thing. But actually, the one thing AI, I suspect, will never be able to do is taste wine and enthuse about it. And our industry we might get to the position where you can pour liquid into a machine and it will analyze it and tell you how good it is relative to other liquids it knows about. So that's easily conceivable. But what it won't be able to do is tell you why it likes it. It will never have that. And so there is always going to be a place for expertise to be able to introduce knowledge to people who haven't got expertise. And that's not just wine, but I think in general, we're all a bit scared of all the threats that AI and continued industrialization can do. But it can't really do taste, can it? And in the broadest possible sense, appreciation of artistry. I don't think it can fake it, but I don't think it can do it.
Yeah, for sure. That like exuding enthusiasm is going to be hard to come out of a hard drive, for sure.
Absolutely, yeah.
And also pairing a wine with a moment is different as well.
Yeah.
Someone who's discerning about the wines that they drink and the wines that they share with their friends and family might choose a particular wine for a particular event, particular moment with particular food that you're just never going to get through an algorithm. Certainly food pairings, maybe, but knowing what this group of 6 people is going to enjoy on this particular night, is something special.
It is, yeah.
So on the topic of taste, I wanted to pivot over a little bit now. We've had a number of MWs on the podcast, and especially on 2025 so far. I love, and I always get this question every time, is I tell people I'm in the MW program. The first question in America is always, oh, cool, you're a Somm. And then I have to explain that I'm not a Somm. I did do the first 2 levels of the CMS, but I've never worked a day on the floor. That doesn't count. Can you share a little bit about maybe some of the high-level differences about the Master Wine Program and the CMS? I know tasting and the way that they taste is a big part of that, so I thought that was a good transition.
Yeah, firstly, neither is better, more difficult, more easy than the other. And I have the most astonishing respect for anybody who's passed a Master Sommelier, and certainly for those very few people who've passed both, one of whom Ben, I had the pleasure of welcoming into the Institute last November, but he's been an MS for a long time. The difference fundamentally, the syllabus in a way is the same, and it's a 2-word syllabus, which is know everything. But what a Master Sommelier needs to do is know everything that a customer might ask them. And what an MW needs to do is know a little bit more the why, but with fewer of the whats. So an MS might need to know examples of 100 gross Gewächs in Germany, for example, whereas an MW wouldn't need to know that. They'd need to know some examples to prove the point, but they need to know why and what producers want in and what producers don't and why that. Whereas you're not likely to be asked that by a customer in a restaurant, so that doesn't form part of the academic process of the CMS. So I think it's rather like MW is narrow but deep, and MS is incredibly wide but shallower. And actually, you multiply it out, it's the same amount of knowledge. It's just a kind of different knowledge, which is why it's so extraordinarily difficult for someone to achieve both. But you're right, Billy, the real secret is to be an MS, you've got to be an S. And you literally have to, I think, you have to have worked the floor. Because I do know someone who tried to do it as an academic exercise, an MW, who thought, okay, I'm going to get both. And couldn't get the second one because he simply hadn't worked in a restaurant and he was high enough up and well paid enough that was an issue. And that's the irony, of course. A lot of people who do become MSs actually stop working the floor. I've got huge respect for those who continue to do it. And I'm sure they all love it and that's why they went into it. But theirs is more vocational and ours is more academic. That I think is the fundamental difference. But having seen how they taste, and I've watched the movie, and that scares the hell out of me. I couldn't do that. And there's an oral exam as well. So there's lots of differences, but there's lots of overlaps. But I think it's joyous that actually they are different, despite the fact that the syllabus is exactly the same. Know everything. Does that answer the question without insulting anyone?
Yeah, I think it's not unthought of that someone would rise to the rank of, say, an MS and then end up not working the floor. Like you said,
Yeah.
The vast majority don't. And it's almost a treat if you were to go somewhere where they have an MS working the floor. I think of Bobby Stuckey, who still spends that time. I have an MS friend in Richmond. Just him and his wife own a little wine shop. He's a national sales director for a distributor as well, but you can walk in and he's serving wine behind the bar, which is, wow, there's probably only a dozen places in the US where you can walk in and there's an MS pouring you wine counter. Yeah, I think I have a lot of respect for the ones who make a career out of the hospitality portion of that as well. Yeah,
me too. A friend of mine who sadly departed to Gerard Basset, you would go into his hotel and you could have wine with him and get it from both sides. Why it was good in both ways. And he was exceptionally good at telling you what you were interested in and knowing which bits you'd be interested in. That's why he made such an astonishing, he was a very charismatic, wonderful guy as well, but that's how he did. He knew it. He did know everything in both ways, but never bored anyone in his life, which is great. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think one other part, can you explain a little bit more about the tasting approach and like why that part is different? Because I do explain to folks where we're both blind tasting, but doing it on paper and writing down and answering other questions, like the actual identification part is much smaller for the MW side as opposed to the CMS, where that's the ultimate goal. Just maybe for our listeners, explain that approach a little bit more.
Yes, well, one thing our qualification can more easily, I think, acknowledge is the degree to which wine is changing. So there is a very limited palette of truly classic wines that you could expect a sommelier to be able to identify exactly what they are, blind and in a hurry and vocally. And that palette of wines is probably shrinking a little bit as the climate changes and as people try different experiments. So there are probably some wines that would never really be in the CMS exam because they can be replicated in other places. Whereas our exam can take account of that by virtue of not asking what it is. And we not very often, but occasionally there are wines in our exams where it's not asked what it is. It's asked how it's come to be, because a good person at wine can work out how the winemaking has been done, and how you might sell it, what its commercial appeal is, and how good it is as an example of its kind, and also just in general. And that's the kind of thing you're very unlikely as a sommelier to be asked in a restaurant. How has this been made? You're more likely to be asked precisely where does it come from? What can you see from that hill? And that isn't the point with a lot of wines. I totally get it that it is very much the point with some wines. So it's not to denigrate either qualification versus the other. But ours is more really about how the liquid has come to exist and how you sell it than it is guess what it is. And I don't think the CMS is guess what it is. I think the CMS is know what it is. I don't think you'd pass if you're guessing. Whereas in our exam, you probably could pass if you guess, because you've got to be so good that your guess is likely to be, if not spot on, then at least very consistent with the liquid. That's the secret to passing the exam, is not to get too hung up on precisely what it is, but to get too hung up on what it might be based on your knowledge of what the liquid tastes of, which wouldn't be a way to pass the CMS. So the methodology is different. We've had people study both simultaneously, and that will never work, I don't think, because it's a different mindset. And indeed, they often go on to pass one or the other, but never both at the same time, as far as I know.
Rod, maybe you can talk to us a little bit about your involvement with IMW now and how your position there since 2006 when you received Master of Wine has changed and your involvements have changed over time.
Yeah, sure. So after I passed, a lot of people immediately after they passed, they pressed pause a little bit because families suffered and work suffered. But I carried on pretty quickly afterwards, getting involved in the education side. There's a very much collegiate thing in our organisation where you're expected to give it back. Almost all the stuff that the MW, I don't really like the word students because it sounds a little patronising, but all the stuff the MW candidates get is given to them by MWs gratis. And that is an expectation on our members that they make themselves available in whatever way they can. And it could be examiners, which is anonymous and hidden. And it could just be mentoring. It could be supplying. It could be anything. But there is an expectation that you give it back. And for me, that was giving it back in terms of the study side. And then after doing that, a position came up on the council. We have a council of it's kind of floating, but it's about 12 people, which determines the future and the kind of governance of the organisation. And a gap came up in that. It's a 3-year position, renewable, and I went forward for it and got voted in. And then from within that, the chair position became available. You get nominated, voted as a vice chair first, and then, if that works. So I'm a veteran. I aim for things all the time. So I don't know what's next. Running another marathon, maybe something like that. So that's how I'm involved. Now the global reach, which was actually a question, wasn't it? Sorry. Very excited that we have now more students, more candidates outside the UK than in it. And the biggest single country is the US, although not by a lot, but North America is very big. More in Asia. There was a little bit of a COVID wobble there, far more in Asia. A couple in South America. South America's our one low, what would the word be? But we got the fewest candidates in South America. But once it starts, it tends to roll a little bit like a boule de neige, like a snowball. We didn't have any Italian MWs until recently, and then one, then two, then the third, and probably the fourth next year. So once it starts, it happens. So far more in France than there was when I started. And the first one we've now got country reach. So yeah, one from Singapore last time. We already got MWs in Singapore, but we got students in Korea. There was one in Qatar. I think he might have moved. So it's becoming more and more global, which is great. And more diverse, more female than male as candidates, which is great. And a little bit more geographical diversity too. So it's very exciting, really.
Yeah, no, I can attest from my seminars and these trips, there are people from all over. I've met a handful, well, maybe not a handful, but a number of folks who would be the first in their country, or at least their region for sure, but a couple from their country. Before moving on too far, you mentioned running. I actually wanted to go back to that real quick and ask you. You had briefly mentioned the marathon that they run in Bordeaux. Can you share a little bit about what it's like to do that? I know this is a complete non sequitur, but I've always been fascinated by that race and how people consume beverages, and I'd never heard of a beer being a stop on the way. I like that aside.
Yeah, that's a good call. I don't want to insult their wine. Yeah, I know what the origin of it was. I think medical students. It was an origin. I don't know. You'd have to check that out. But it's been run because there's already a marathon of Bordeaux, a longer running, and the marathon to Médoc traditionally would be in between the white harvest and the red harvest, and it still is. It just moves. So it's now the first weekend of September, I think, and it just became It was a charity raising thing at first. That was its thing. Fancy dress. Yeah, there was a medical thing, definitely. So lots of the doctors and nurses would do it to raise money. And then the chateau got involved because it was the Médoc. And so now there's stop-off points where you get to taste some wine or drink it if you want. I'm not sure it was actually the first of these. I think they called it Foulet, where you run and drink. But I think it was probably the first one that's actually a proper marathon. So when I first did it, I thought, well, I'm not drinking wine and running. These two things just don't have an overlap in my mind. That just sounds too pukey. But we got channeled in just out of Pauillac into Château Lafite. And the problem with the race is you get these almost bottlenecks, really, where you get so many people passing through a small gate that you end up stopping. And having stopped, you just think, well, might as well have a glass of wine then. So that's what happened. And it's usually, sure as hell wasn't Lafite, but it was definitely Bordeaux, and it was from Lafite. Who's going to turn down the chance of a taste of red wine in the grounds of Château Lafite? You just can't, really, if you're a wine person. So I did a few the first year, and then I think the last time I ran it, I just tasted everything. Or just what I'm going to say. But you don't actually drink it, and you're sweating so much that I don't think you certainly don't get any kind of alcohol impact. But I don't know whether it's totally good for the constitution. But it's the slowest marathon. Well, that's what they say. And they send the clear up truck, I think, after 6.5 hours. You couldn't walk it, but at the same time, you don't have to be a particularly great runner to get round. So it's terrific fun. And there is an expectation, I think, to get dressed up and make a bit of money for charity. But it's now become a global thing. So it's hard to get into. But there are some lovely properties. And yeah, there's one that's Belgian owned, and they put some beer on, which actually is quite late in, and something cold and fresh is very welcome. Yeah, and probably has the edge on their wine.
Yeah, Billy does beer miles. That's what he does.
Okay.
No. The LA marathon just happened right before I left, and I'm convinced that I could walk/run it, and my wife doesn't think so as much. But when I think this one might be the right pace, because this one actually has serious runners. That one, I feel like I could blend in and just kind of mosey along and make it.
The marathon does have serious runners. They set off earlier, so there's a way through. And actually, each of the chateau will have, as part of its team, someone who's seriously good at running, and they all try and get the winner. And I think, don't quote me on this, but I'm pretty sure that the Marathon de Médoc has been run in as little as 2 hours, 11 minutes, which is nearly world record, especially since it's quite hilly and you get quite a lot of angles. So I think that someone's running crazily fast. And like a top athlete runner. So the chateau will all invite and presumably pay, although probably in wine and accommodation, someone really super good at running to do it in their colours.
It's like a representative, like their champion. It's not somebody. I thought you meant somebody who works like in the cellar. Like you always have one person.
No, probably no. I don't think you get anyone who can run that quick. So no, I don't quote on the 2 hours 11, but it does stick in my head like absurdly quick for a marathon that is not set up to be run super like Berlin or a flat one or something. Yeah, then they do invite top runners, but those guys set off early, and obviously they don't drink any wine. They don't stop. So yeah,
they probably finish, come back. They finish and come back to the wine before you're even at the wine.
Oh yeah, sure, yeah. I've run London a couple. If you run London, you end up running towards all the people who are doing much better than you because they've already done the whole loop. I look a lot better. And that's a little bit dispiriting, actually, if you're not very quick. But there you go. Yeah, I'm not a very fast runner, but I do enjoy it.
Awesome. Well, pivoting back to the IMW, I've always just been curious about that race. I think they did it on an episode of the Wine Show years back too, and it was fun to watch. But pivoting back here, I guess that's something that since I was just in Bordeaux, and that's why we were talking about it, partnerships that you have with different producers, organizations throughout the world. Can you share a little bit about those and why they're important to how we operate, or how the MW operates? MW.
Yes, absolutely. As an organization, we couldn't do it without our supporters and our principal supporters, which Axel Millésime, are the owners of Chateau Pichon Baron, and that's the team I run for. It's where you had your gala dinner. I was sad I couldn't be there with Chris, and Christian also runs the marathon as well, and that's quite good fun to run with him. So Axel Millésime, principal supporter, VSPT from Chile, who have Argentinian and Chilean brands, Champagne Bollinger, which has been with us from the absolute beginning, Constellation brand. That's an interesting development because they came on as Mondavi. That then became part of a bigger company. It looks as though that might be changing, but in a way, I hope that the relationship between them and the IMW will continue possibly back as Mondavi, but something. Anyway, we're working on that, and we're in contact with them. And wines of Austrian wine are our fifth principal supporter. And they're very important. Then we have our major supporters and then our supporters. And like anything that has sponsorship, it's an interchange. We're the best at wine academia, not education, because the CMS could claim that for sure, but we're the best at really that high end. And they're the best at whatever they do. And it's all wine. So the association cuts both ways, but it's not like a marketing exercise. They give us money, they get extra sales. It's more ambassadorship and interest. It's hard to put into rate of return on interest investment, but at the same time, it's not hard because there's a thing where the best should work with the best. And that then means we can put their wines in front of our people like you and us, which is great exposure for them in a way. And it means that they can support us by making sure our program is more accessible. And it's crazily expensive because of the wine. It's not for profit, and that's what it costs. But actually, if we weren't for our supporters, it would cost so much more that it might not even function. But if it did, it would only be for seriously wealthy people. And that's not the point, really. There is a limit. You've got to taste a lot of wine. And obviously, if you can share that with others and dilute that cost, that's great. But you can't circumvent it. It's not a cheap thing to do, but it is its own reward. But without our supporters, it might not exist at all, but certainly it would be so much more restrictive. So we're very, very grateful to them.
Rod, I'm curious, on our podcast, we talk a lot about, we might have a producer on, we might also have a critic on. And so we end up talking about trends and conversations in the wine world from all these different perspectives. I'm sure there are maybe similar conversations happening in the MW community that are happening in the, let's call it, broader wine economy. But are there any sort of particular things that when you are chatting with MWs about sort of the state of the union that are coming up consistently, or that folks are talking about for the next 10 years outside of maybe the run-of-the-mill topics like climate change and other things?
Well, yeah, of course. And we've got 425 members, which means we've got at least 850 different opinions. So we're not an advocacy organisation, although in some respects, when it comes to alcohol and health and some aspects of tax and diversity and inclusion, that kind of thing, we can speak with one voice. But other than that, I can't speak for the members, and no one member can speak for the others because we have such a wide variety of opinions, positions, what we do ourselves personally. But of course, we talk about this stuff, and we had our big get together is our symposium, which is every 4 years, subject to a pandemic happening. So then it was a 3-year thing, but next year in Australia, and then 2030 to be announced. And we get together and we talk generally about current issues. There's always a bit of looking back, because looking back informs looking forward, but there's always something about looking forward. So there was a big thrust in our last symposium on regenerative viticulture, which I think is hugely important. We can't skirt around the fact that vine growing is not actually a particularly planet-friendly agriculture when it comes to the chemicals that are used. The percentage of agrochemicals in France that are used on vines is alarmingly high. So we like to think of ourselves as being all very kind of good for everyone, and we can be, but we're not. And we all know that sticking copper in the soil eventually doesn't do the soil any good, although fortunately nature seems to put it right much quicker than we gave her credit for. And I think that's changing. So how you do it in the future is always at the top of our mind. And if we can help shape that, if we can be advocacy, then in that respect, I think we should. If we can speak with a common voice on things that we believe should happen, then we should do that. And of course, you've got a crisis in wine at the moment, which is that people are drinking less. It seems very odd to me that wine is suffering the most out of this. I would think, logically speaking, if people think alcohol's bad, then spirits are worse. And I say that as someone who likes a gin and tonic or Negroni, whatever. But I believe the reason for this is that wine became extraordinarily popular in the 80s and 90s with our parents or grandparents. And it's just a reaction to that. If something balloons, then eventually it will deflate a little bit. And I don't think it means there's anything wrong with wine. I think it's just a fashion thing. And fashions change. And our job is to make sure that it becomes fashionable again. And if we can do it on the basis that it's the kind of more acceptable face of alcohol than spirits, that it's respecting thousands of years of tradition, not that distillation and brewing doesn't do that, but there's a lot about wine that is intrinsically lined up with human history and culture. But I don't think it's under threat. I think what's under threat is mass-produced wine as an alcoholic drink, and that can afford to be under threat. It's not great for the people involved, but what will happen if people stop drinking is they'll stop drinking inexpensive, mass-produced packet yeast identikit wine that could come from anywhere, out of which not many people are making very much money, and it's hurting the environment. And what will thrive is the small people, the family people, the people with more of an eye on quality and less of an eye on price point and more of an eye on artistry. So that's the good side of it. And obviously I know that people are going to suffer financially. Of course they are. But it's possible that good can come from bad in every circumstance. And I hope that's what happens. So these areas that are losing vineyards at the moment, they're losing the bad vineyards, not the good ones. And that innately means what's left will be better. That's my hope.
How are you seeing some of these more traditional, like wine has been notoriously slow to evolve in terms of marketing, I guess, and like innovation on that front. Like it's a lot of focuses in the vineyards. So like the Madeira that you had the other night that you brought from your class made me think of it. It's the new Blandy's packaging where they have a clear bottle now and then they have a blue label and they had all this information. I had actually just read the press release, so it was really cool to see it in person. And it's like, this is their move to try to innovate and be more approachable to younger people. How do you see that working well or better in some cases than others for some folks, or how have you seen that in response?
Yeah, I mean, when you've got absolutely pure innovation for innovation's sake, that just packaging-led wine marketing, it doesn't tend to deliver a particularly great product. But when you've got a great product that embraces that, and I know Chris reasonably well, and I can totally see where that's come from. What's really nice about Madeira is that it's already done its descent. And now it's got an uptick. It's a very small uptick. There's still a lot of suffering, a lot of competition on the island for other crops and all the rest of it. But people are realizing how good Madeira is, and it's not too late. And actually, there's another parallel, which is even more kind of pertinent if it's not related to wine specifically, and that's vermouth, which was terribly unfashionable and now is really coming back. Now, I know that's cocktails, but at the same time, it uses wine as a base, so it's linked to our industry, and I think that's a reflection of this whole fashion, in fashion, dramatically out of fashion, post-ironic, back in fashion again. And you see some really interesting packaging on that, but some of it is it creates labels that look as though they were designed 100 years ago, but that actually works on a number of foodstuffs. So innovation for innovation's sake, I'm not a fan of, but innovation within the category, I think is great. And the Blandy clear glass, when once upon a time they used to dye it with caramel to make it the same shade of brown, that's a real continuation of revitalizing an industry.
Yeah. Well, what I liked the most, and it was cool seeing it in person, is like on it, I have my photo of it here, but they have matured 10 years in American oak casks. Like they have this information that I think in the past people just knew or didn't care about, but that is such a cool differentiator. It's such a good value, especially you see it on the shelf in the American market at a very affordable prices compared to other things. And people are like, wow, I didn't know that was aged 10 years. And I think there's some of these stories that could easily be told and not bore people. And I think it's cool to see something that, like, I love Madeira. So I like to see something that I love, not trying just to give up and keep doing the same thing over and over.
Well, yeah, absolutely. Well, I think all wine people love Madeira, but it's happening in other. I was at a champagne house where young guy takes over from his father. His father principally sold the grapes. Lombard, and I can't remember his name. I think it's Thomas. He's a young guy, and the back labels have got so much information. You actually have to peel it off, and it's there in the middle. And it's literally every plot, who picked it, when, where, the titrate, everything you could possibly want to know and more. But you don't have to. You could just leave it shut if all you want is the kind of sophisticated. And I just think that's really champagne becoming a wine again in the hands of a younger generation who, it's about money. I'm sure he's probably making more money than his father did, but actually it's about love of the vineyards. And that just comes across when you speak to him and you look at that packaging. It's a single Meunier, for example, he makes. And you just think, well, that's a tough call. But actually, it's a really great wine, and he explains why, and I think that's super important. So you don't get much more traditional than champagne in some respects, And it's happening in Bordeaux as well. It's too slow in Bordeaux. Bordeaux is in crisis because they haven't arguably reacted quickly enough. But you look at some of the packaging that's going on the second wines and what Jean-Luc Tunevin did with his old bad boy stuff and all that. There is innovation happening and it does work. And we do need that a little bit. Yeah.
You have some connection to Champagne Bollinger, isn't that correct?
Yes, I worked for Champagne. Yeah, look, cut me in half, and a little bit of me would bleed Bollinger for sure. Yeah. Etienne's a great guy, and Denny, the winemakers. Yeah, it's really nice. And when I first started working there, the winemaker, the chef de cave, was a Matthew Kaufmann. I don't know if you know him. He's then in Von Bull in Germany, and now I think he's doing something. One of those people whose enthusiasm just radiates out, and you just can't help soak it up. Yeah.
Yeah, and the top producers in Champagne many of them have such mystique around the world, and then obviously deeper in the wine world, you get into the grower community, and there's so much to be explored there, like what you just described with the Meunier bottling. How does someone maybe who doesn't have in terms of proximity access to that market, maybe someone in the States, how would you say to go about trying to access a market like Champagne and some of those smaller producers that hard to come by?
Well, I guess you need to speak to your import, and that depends where you are. Obviously, it's easier in New York and California, and let's forget the whole current issue, because if there's anything that could be said about what's happening right now, is that it can change in an hour, can't it? So we'll see. But actually, the best way to experience a wine region is to visit the wine region. So obviously that's hassle, but you can't really get the best of Santa Barbara without going to Santa Barbara, because it doesn't leave. Probably that's not true of Napa, but it is true of pretty much every other American wine region, where the truly best and interesting and niche product is sold cellar door. And that's the case the world over. So travel is your answer. And there are definitely some growers Champagne, and they don't really need anything possibly beyond local, but probably not beyond Paris, because their production's so small. And that's always going to be the case. And that's a good thing fundamentally. But it does make it difficult, because you have to go to the place. An importer is not going to be interested in a product that is only, the allocation is in the kind of
2 cases.
Only the tens of cases and
Sure,
not guaranteed. Yeah. I wouldn't think, and certainly a restaurant. And some of the best are only available at that kind of quantity, and that's the issue.
Well, I like that we started the conversation talking about bottles that sell the world over in secondary markets for $20,000, and starting to wrap it up here with bottles maybe that are sold for under $75 or so at the cellar door. Yeah, and both are needed in the industry, right, to keep the culture of it all.
And more of the latter than the former, but the former feeds into it.
Yeah.
And people need to make money out of this. And yeah, I totally get both of those things. Yeah.
Awesome. So last thing, what are you most not excited about, but drinking right now? Like, whoa, I know people go through phases like the moon. What are you drinking right now? I just can't get enough of these.
Well, I'm drinking a cup of tea right now, but that's because I'm a Brit abroad and it's still the day. Well, I of the local wines, I live in Provence, and clearly you're going to get the best wine locally. So I bought some really lovely Bando. I judge Provence for Decanter World Wine Awards, and you judge it all blind and you give the scores. And there was just some lovely, lovely, really lovely wines, of course. And then they send you the Excel spreadsheet with what you'd written, how much you'd scored it, and what it is, like a month or 2 months later. And I looked at it and I thought, well, it was really, really great wine from what I'd written and what I remembered. And it wasn't that expensive. So I actually emailed them and I said, look, is there any conflict of interest here if I just go and buy some of this before it's published? No, not at all. So I did. And I bought a couple of cases of that because it was just really terrific. And Bandor's another one. It's steeped in tradition, but Mourvèdre used to be often a little bit on the Brettanomyces side, shall we say. A traditional was part of that. Now there's hardly any of that. They've really cleaned it up. And there's no shortage of markets. It's a valuable wine region and it's feeding into kind of luxury markets. But it's really good value compared to some other great red wines of the world. So I'm enjoying that. One advantage of living in Nice is you can get to Italy in 45 minutes. So that's quite useful because Italy doesn't tax wine at all. Well, France doesn't really, but I can get a fabulous range of Italian wines and I can get to Barolo in 3 hours, let's say, to keep it legal. and I've got a lot of good friends there. And again, if you go there, that's your best chance to have certainly tastings and even buying things that you can't get further afield.
For sure.
Yeah.
I don't think you're going to have to twist many people's arms to go to Bandal.
Yeah, well, it's really changing. For traditional wine areas, really, unfortunately, it's changing in the bad direction as well, in that they're making more rosé and they're making more pale rosé because that's an easier way to make money. But they'll be using their less good fruit to do that, which will actually have the effect of making the red wines even better, even if it makes less of them. But I don't think they should be making Provence rosé in that very pale style from Mourvedre, because what's the point? But the point is that's the one they can sell. But it doesn't mean they're going to stop making the reds and the whites, especially as well. So yeah, things change. Even in the most traditional areas, things change, and that's the exciting thing. Nothing ever stops.
Thanks so much, Rod. I'm glad that you and Billy had a sort of a chance meeting this week. Thanks for all that you do. You're helping to educate folks and train up the next generation of masters of wine. Appreciate that. And yeah, we will be in touch. Hopefully, as Billy progresses through his program too, we can have you back on. And
Happy
Billy New will be number 488. That's the in-house prediction that we have for Billy. So
he'd do it quicker than that, because that's some time away. I think 488.
Hey, I appreciate the confidence. Yeah, thank you so much, Rod. This has been great.
Great. Thank you very much, guys.
All right. That was our interview with Rod Smith, Master of Wine. I hope everybody learned a little bit more about what the Institute of Master of Wine is all about, and maybe you'll be able to have a better sense of the difference between the Master of Wine and Master Sommelier. But for now, that is our episode for this week. Stay tuned for our new mini producer episode that will come out in the coming week. And we will be back with another full episode next week. Cheers.